Welcome into Steelers Talk. I'm your host, Jack Sperry, and today we're going to be talking about how new Steelers defensive coordinator Patrick Graham is about to transform the Pittsburgh Steelers defense in the way that this organization approaches defensive football. Now, before we get into a little bit of a spotlight here on Coach Graham, make sure you guys click that thumbs up icon if you haven't already to welcome Coach Graham to the Steel City. He is one of the more respected defensive minds in the National Football League. We're going to talk about those reasons why on today's show. So if you're excited for this new era of defensive football here in Pittsburgh, click that thumbs up icon and help out today's show. All right, guys. So the first thing that you guys need to know about our new defensive coordinator, Patrick Graham, is that he doesn't adhere to any specific scheme. It's not like he's like Jim Schwartz, for example, where he's like a wide 9, 4-3, press man, and if you can't run that system, you're not going to be a part of the team. All right. Graham's the type of guy where he takes his defensive talent and then tailors his scheme based on the players that he has and then also the opponent that they play every single week. And his core principles as a defensive play caller are adaptability and versatility. He wants to be able to change things on a dime if he sees something that he can take advantage of on the opposing sideline. He wants to be able to do a lot of different things, and he doesn't want to be beholden to a specific type of scheme if he doesn't have the players to run a certain type of scheme. And, he's kind of been dubbed the schematic chameleon in the National Football League, especially since Bill Belichick moved to college football and was fired by the New England Patriots. Like, Graham is kind of the example in the National Football League now of, changing your fronts, changing your scheme based on your personnel and kind of tailoring your offense to the strengths and weaknesses of the players that you have on your team, as opposed to, this is the system that I run. We're going to get players to run my system, and it's my way or the highway, okay? I think that this is a really good approach that has led to Bill Belichick, in my mind, being the greatest defensive mind in the history of the National Football League. And I think, if you can run a lot of different stuff and you can, be adaptable and you can make adjustments, mid-game, mid-season, the way that Belichick did for years, the way that Graham has been doing throughout his defensive play calling career, I think that gives you, a fantastic opportunity to get the most out of your defensive talent. And I think that's exactly what Patrick Graham has done, even though he hasn't had a ton of great, defensive rosters in any of his stops. We'll talk about his influences here in a second and his history, but the fact that he's been able to, kind of make chicken salad out of chicken shit out of all these places that he's been, kind of shows, how good and how respected of a defensive mind that he is. And, the adaptability and the versatility comes from everywhere in the defense, in the scheme. Everything from the front where he doesn't care if you run a 3-3-5 or a 4-2 or a 4-3 or a 3-4 or 5-1 or 6-1. He's run a ton of these different fronts, jet fronts, Okie fronts. He will throw out the kitchen sink at an offense and force them to figure out what the hell they're doing. And he will, base those fronts and that plan to attack a quarterback in an opposing team's run game based on the opponent, what their strengths and weaknesses are, what scheme they run, etc. And I think that allows this Steelers defense in the future here to be multiple, to be able to attack the weaknesses of opposing teams week in and week out. And like I said, guys, Patrick Graham got this philosophy from, in my opinion, the greatest defensive mind in the history of football, Bill Belichick, who famously, tailored his weekly game plans and, what schemes they were running week to week based on what opponent that they were running and the talent that they had on that Patriots defense. It was a different game plan every single week instead of just saying, we're going to run what we run, and if you can't fit into what we run, then you're not going to be playing here, and we're going to go and get other players. I think, you can get a lot of different types of players and talented players in your system, and, you can be more adaptable when there's injuries, and you can attack the weaknesses of an opposing team and their scheme and their personnel. And I think, the success of Bill Belichick over his many years in the National Football League speaks for itself, and I think that this defensive philosophy here in Pittsburgh, especially with the talent that we have here, is going to work swimmingly. And this is really a far cry from where we're coming from here with Mike Tomlin and Terrell Austin, where like they wanted to run what they run, cover 3, cover 1, single high safety, 3-4 base. They've run what they've run, and they've been kind of getting players to fit the roles that they had in their defense, and they weren't really great at adapting. And I thought that they made some nice adjustments last year, midway through the year. Bringing in Kyle Duggar, moving Jalen Ramsey to safety, and playing more 2 high safety stuff than they did at the beginning of the season. Moving off of Darius Slay. It's not like Tomlin and Austin, didn't make some changes that were good for this defense last year. But generally speaking, Mike Tomlin and Terrell Austin's philosophy here in Pittsburgh is we're going to run what we run, and you have to fit what we run here, or you're not going to be here. It's the exact opposite approach here in Pittsburgh, which I'm very excited about. Now we can talk about Patrick Graham's influences when it comes to where he cut his teeth in the National Football League, and most of his development came under Belichick in New England, where he was a linebackers and defensive line coach, which I really like because he's a front master. All right, his ability to switch up fronts and know how to exploit an offense up front, I think is going to be really exciting, especially because of the talent that we have in the front here in Pittsburgh with the great defensive line and some really talented linebackers as well. I think he's going to be able to get the most out of somebody like a Peyton Wilson, for example. But then he goes to New England, where he works for Steve Spagnuolo, and he runs a 4-2 bump and run style of defense there. And they're playing a lot of man coverage, and they're dropping out of cover 0 looks. And he was a defensive lines coach there, got the most out of that group. And then he goes to 2018 with Mike McCarthy as the head coach, working under Mike Pettin as the DC, where they run kind of like a classic Dom Capers, almost Dick LeBeau style, attacking 3-4 fire zone style defense. So he got the fire zone stuff under his belt as well. And as a defensive coordinator throughout his career, and Graham's got a ton of experience being a defensive play caller, so it's not like you're getting a rookie DC that's learning on the job here. He's changed his tendencies in terms of what his defenses do every single year, which shows his versatility and what he's willing to do to get the most out of his defensive personnel. You guys can take a look at his journey. He starts with the Miami Dolphins under Brian Flores, so he's got a little bit of Flores in his blood as well here in 2019, and they ran a very Belichickian style, man-heavy, multiple up front and 3 safety defense. So that's kind of the classic Belichick. He put you can also call it big nickel, but they call it 3 safety, and lots of press man, lots of cover 1, but they'll drop out into cover 3 as well. Then in 2020 through 2021, when he really didn't have a lot to work with there in New York, he ran a 3-3-5 cover 3 base defense, and then he would do a lot of crazy disguises, and he would do some awesome post-snap rotations, and he would have really ambiguous rush looks in the front. Like, he had some really creative stuff, and in my opinion, with the players that he had in New York, which he did not have a lot of talent there those 2 seasons, what he was able to do with that defense was super, super impressive, which then led to his tenure with Josh McDaniels to start in Las Vegas, where he ran a 2 high safety heavy defense, so completely different from the man stuff that he ran with Belichick and with Flores, and then the cover 3 stuff that he ran in New York. Now he's running quarters. Now he's running cover 6. Now he's running Tampa 2, and they're doing a lot of 2 high safety stuff because they didn't really have a lot of talent in the secondary, so they tried to keep everything in front of them, and they tried to play bend, don't break. Then in 2024, they ran like a Brian Flores cover 0 heavy defense, or they played a lot of man, they played a lot of cover 0. They didn't. Max Crosby was hurt for a lot of the year, so they pretty much went into a 4-3 under front. They put everybody up at the line of scrimmage. And then they attacked quarterbacks because they didn't have their best pass rusher, so they adjusted in that way. And then in this year, he gets retained by another head coach. All right, he was retained through 3 different head coaches with the Raiders, by the way, McDaniels, Pierce, and then Pete Carroll. And they ran Carroll's Seattle 3, especially in the second half of this season with the Las Vegas Raiders. Pete Carroll, it's been well reported that he completely took over the defensive game planning and the defensive scheming in the second half of the year, where the defense really started to crumble. guys. So in my opinion, you can essentially throw out the end of 2025 for Patrick Graham. Even though he was still technically calling plays, Pete Carroll was the one that was driving the ship from a schematic standpoint. And if you look at the Raiders' defensive stats in the first half of the season when Max Crosby was healthy, they were a much better group than at the end of the season when Pete Carroll took over and Max Crosby was dealing with his injuries. So, an unfortunate constant with Patrick Graham in his career, and why some fans are going to look at his numbers and his production throughout the year and say, this guy sucks, why'd we bring him in, is because he's had subpar defensive roster talent and, at every single stop that he's had. I mean, in 2019, Stephen Ross, the Dolphins owner, reportedly offered Brian Flores an extra $100,000 in a bonus for every game that they lost. And I'm guessing he probably gave Chris Greer, the GM, a similar type of bonus. So they built the roster to lose that year, and that defense was still an above-average defense that year with pretty much a practice squad level roster. And then he goes to New York. Nobody has any expectations for that defense just because of the lack of talent. And they had like a top 10 unit under Patrick Graham, borderline top 10 group, definitely overperforming. And then he goes to Las Vegas, where once again, no roster talent in any of the 4 years that he's there outside of Max Crosby. And, back in 2023, running the quarters and cover 6 and Tampa 2 style defense with the post-snap rotations and the multiple front stuff, he was able to get that unit with just Max Crosby as the only star-level player on that group to be a top 10 unit in EPA per play. So this is somebody that, in my opinion, has really made the most of his situations. And, he gets his groups to punch above their weight, and that's a far cry, like I was talking about with the previous regime here in Pittsburgh, where, Terrell Austin and Mike Tomlin would make all these investments to the defensive side of the ball and spend so much on the defensive side of the ball. And then, they would have, maybe an A- level defensive roster to an A-level roster, and they'd get like B-level production out of them. It's just not good enough in the modern day NFL if you're going to be spending that much money on that side of the ball. But like Patrick Graham has had like D-level rosters, and he's been able to turn them into like at least B-level defenses. That's 2 letter grades, being elevated based on, where he's starting, with his roster talent, and then where he takes them with the final end results. And you got to take everything in the proper context, right? Right, guys? That's why, we try to be as in-depth as possible as we can here on Steelers Talk, because everything, comes down to, what do you have to work with? What's your supporting cast? What players do you have to work with? The Steelers have had great players over the last several years, have underperformed. Graham is the exact opposite, where he has not had good players and he has overperformed, which makes me think that he's going to get the most out of this Steelers defense than we've seen in many years. And at the end of the day, guys, people that work in the NFL, they know ball. These are the people that are grinding film, that are super competitive, that are trying to find any competitive edge. And, these are the guys that want to hire Patrick Graham. These are the guys that have been in the league a long time and respect what he's able to do with a defensive roster. And, there's a reason why he is so respected in league circles, and why, Mike McCarthy made him the prioritization here to be the next defensive coordinator of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And now, he gets the most talented defensive roster he has had by far. I mean, like, you look at that 2023 Raiders team where he was 9th in EPA per play. Like, Robert Spillane was his number 2 best player on that team. Number 1 was Max Crosby, and it's nice to have that guy, but like, if your number 2 best defensive player that year is Robert fucking Spillane, like, that roster is not very good, and he elevated that roster by quite a bit. Now he gets TJ Watt, so he still gets his Max Crosby type, his number 1 edge rusher, but along with that, you get Alex Highsmith, Nick Herbig. You've got, Patrick Queen if he stays, Peyton Wilson, who's a very talented player, Derek Harmon. You've got Cam Hayward if he returns, Keanu Benton. You got Joey Porter Jr. You got Deshaun Elliott, Jalen Ramsey, who can still be a really good nickel player. Like, he's going to have by far the most talent he's ever had, and I can't wait to see what this Patrick Graham defense looks like here in Pittsburgh now that he finally has a roster that, is worthy of his defensive mind. And coming up here, I'm going to be projecting what the Pittsburgh Steelers defense is going to look like. For the most part, I do expect it to be pretty multiple, and it's going to be a different game plan every week based on the opponent that we're playing. But I'll kind of lay out, some things that I think Graham is going to be implementing here in 2026 in just a second. But let me know down there in the comment section, what is your confidence level in Patrick Graham as the defensive coordinator of the Pittsburgh Steelers? Put it on a scale of 1 to 10 for me. 1 meaning not at all, this brother stinks, to 10 meaning he's going to be the best defensive coordinator we've ever had here in Pittsburgh. Let me know what you guys think down there in the comment section. This will be the pinned comment on today's show. So in just a second here, I'm going to tell you about our sponsor. Well, I'll let you know about our sponsor today. Put a number between 1 and 10 for me down there in the comments. And if you guys want a Steelers row pack, kind of similar to the one I'm wearing wearing right now, actually. You guys can get it right now on our website, chatsports.com/pitrope, to get this Pittsburgh Steelers rope hat in your collection today. It helps out the channel as well, guys. Every time someone clicks that link, I'm going to put that link in the comments and description of today's show, by the way. You click that link, make a purchase, and some of the proceeds come back to us here at Steelers Talk, and that helps us pay for our graphics and our software and all of our monitors and our cameras and keeping the lights on and paying rent and doing all that stuff. So if you guys want to help us out and you want to get a brand new Pittsburgh Steelers hat to usher in a new era of Steelers football under Mike McCarthy, go chatsports.com/pitrope. Appreciate your guys' support. Now, my best guess in terms of what the base defense is going to look like for Patrick Graham here in Pittsburgh is that it's going to resemble a Belichick-style defense, okay? And, a Belichick-style defense is very chameleon-like, where it's going to change week to week, but it does have core tenets that if you have the horses, and I believe the Steelers will have the horses in terms of defensive talent, that they abide by. First, they have a 3-4 base front, so that's what they'll go out in. They like versatile outside linebackers, and guess what the Steelers have? They've got three guys in Watt, Highsmith, and Herbig that can all go out into coverage, which will be very good for simulated pressures and, dropping those guys into coverage the way that you see a lot of these modern defenses run. They did that a ton in New England. I expect a lot of that in this defense. Also, front flexibility. I don't expect it to just be that 3-4 base front all the time. I expect, ambiguous rush looks, and I would expect Okie fronts and jet fronts and 5-1 penny fronts when they play outside zone heavy teams. I do think that they will go to a lot of different types of fronts, and they will customize their fronts based on the opponent every single week. Also, 3 safety and big nickel is going to be a big part of this defense, in my opinion, especially because you got Jalen Ramsey on the team. Ramsey, I think, is getting a bad rap because he didn't finish the season great at safety this past year for the Steelers, but I think he'll be the big nickel type of player, that bandit safety that's going to be roaming all over the place, and I think he can still be very valuable as that kind of player in this defense. Also, if they can play press man, I think they will. You look at some of the best defenses in football, the Broncos, the Texans, those teams play a lot of man because they can. So if the Steelers can get a good press man corner to go opposite of Joey Porter Jr., I think that's the preferred style that they would like to play. Also, Belichick used to have a philosophy of blitz the hell out of the quarterback until you can't, until he makes you stop. I expect that to be a similar type of approach from Patrick Graham. And then also weekly tailored game plans like I've been talking about. I think it's going to be very similarly structured to what Belichick ran there in New England. And then, a possible wrinkle that, they didn't do a lot in New England that we could see here in Pittsburgh is 3 outside linebacker fronts. Nick Herbig sounds like he's going to be pretty much giving the team an ultimatum. I need to have a full starter's workload this year or I want out. And unless you're willing to trade TJ Watt or Alex Highsmith, I don't know if you want to extend Nick Herbig, especially because it doesn't sound like he wants to be extended by the team unless he's getting a full starter's workload. So maybe the way that you could do that is you can have, all 3 of these guys out there at the same time. I don't know how exactly that would work, but, I'm sure Patrick Graham, as creative of a mind as he is on the defensive side of the ball, if anybody can find a way to give starter quality reps to Watt, Highsmith, and Herbig and keep all 3 of these guys in Pittsburgh for the foreseeable future, it is Patrick Graham. I also think he's going to use Ramsey and Deshaun Elliott in really fun ways as well. He can be really creative with some safety blitzes, some nickel blitzes, and that's what Elliott and Ramsey do at a really, really high level. They're really good run defenders, really good tacklers. You can put either of those guys at the line of scrimmage. You can rock and roll those guys. You get a legitimate free safety this offseason, which I think will be a pretty big need for the Steelers this offseason with Patrick Graham coming in, and you can really have some fun with Ramsey and Elliott, who are both kind of dynamic joker type of pieces that you can move around as chess pieces in the Steelers defense. And, plain and simply, guys, if Pittsburgh is going to take the next step in 2026 and go from a team that is competing for a playoff spot like we have been the last several years under Mike Tomlin to a team that's going to be competing for championships, especially in the short term, this defense has to be truly great, okay? They've got to be a Denver Broncos style defense. They got to be, Houston Texans. They've got to be top 3, at least top 5 in the league. because that's where most of the money and most of, the talent is invested on this football team, at least right now. So, it was the same thing last year. It was the same thing the year before. This defense can be elite. The Steelers can have a chance to make noise in the playoffs. Unfortunately, the Steelers defense has not been elite over the last several years, especially at the end of the season. And hopefully Patrick Graham can get the most out of this group like he has throughout most of his career. And, I think that he's got a pretty good shot at doing that with his ability to be adaptable, to be versatile, to be confusing for opposing quarterbacks. And, with his history, especially, helping out Belichick in New England and seeing how good those defenses were when they had top flight talent, it just gets me really excited to think about the future of defensive football here in Pittsburgh. And, I think this guy was one of the top candidates on my list, and I'm really excited that he is a Pittsburgh Steeler. So predict it for me down there in the comment section. Will Pittsburgh have a top 5 defense in 2026? Simply give me a yes or a no down there in the comment section to let me know what you guys think. And that'll be it for today's edition of Steelers Talk by Chat Sports. We will have another video coming out later with all the latest coaching updates. I've got some stuff on Nick Herbig, Patrick Queen, Cam Hayward that we'll talk about on our PM video as well. So if you don't want to miss that, make sure you guys click that subscribe button if you haven't already. Till next time, guys, here we go, Steelers.